I always talk about like kind of managing a credit card. You've got $200 on your credit card. How are you going to spend it across the week? I can't spend $100 on a 15K steady state session. There's just no way, because otherwise I've got no money left for the rest of the week. Ultimately, there's one event in a season that these guys have got to be prepared for, and that's either a World Championships or an Olympic Games. And everything you're doing from a physical preparation perspective is catered towards that. It seems like a no-brainer to me that should be a part of the athlete profile, and I can't for the life of me figure it out in rowing as to why traditionally it's not really done that much. There's a reason these guys are at the top of their performance, and it's not because their weaknesses are shit. It's because they've definitely got something that's making them an elite and a top performer. I think sometimes we don't give the athletes enough accountability, and we don't always listen to them enough, and we should make sure we take the time to do that.
All right, James, welcome to the podcast. How you doing, buddy?
Good, thank you, mate. Thanks for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. We've exchanged a lot over the last few weeks, so it's great to have you on now and make that a little more formal. So for those who don't know who you are yet, can you talk about you, your background, and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I work with the Swiss rowing team. So I work as the kind of physical performance coach and sports science kind of lead. So I've been doing that for, coming up to 4 years soon, which is unreal. I can't believe how much time I've been doing that for, but pretty crazy. So my main background is as a S&C coach before I worked with the Swiss team. So I worked for just under 3 years with the British rowing team. So in the kind of build up to the Rio Olympic Games, kind of across all groups. So kind of elite down to junior and development. And then I've worked in a couple of other different sports. So I did some bits with swimmers, land hockey, a bit of boxing, and then also some bits in pro football and pro rugby as well. So fairly diverse, but worked in rowing now for nearly 7 years, which is again pretty crazy. But yeah, so that's me.
Since you've had the experience on both sides, can you talk a little bit about what it's like in England in terms of the rowing culture and the physical preparation side for rowers, and then what you experience here in Switzerland? What are the big differences?
Yeah, so it's there are some things that are very similar. So there are cultural things within rowing that are seem very transferable, certainly across both the nations that I've worked in, and I think that's down to this kind of hard work, hard ethic, high training volume kind of culture that's really deeply integrated in rowing and seems to follow it around everywhere. So I've definitely noticed that hasn't changed since moving to Switzerland. There are definitely some different approaches in terms of rowing style. The kind of makeup of the programs are very different. There's still an emphasis kind of on full-time centralized training, which is pretty important for most of the rowers. But how that's kind of split is very different. There's certainly a bigger focus on kind of steady state, high volume training in Britain compared to a more intensity-based model in Switzerland. There's definitely differences kind of within the athletes themselves. So typically in Britain, you'll have some rowers that have started from when they were 11 or 12. Like it's traditionally quite an upper class sport. So a lot of private school kids will pick up rowing when they're put into school. And it might be the only sport that they've done for most of their life. And compare that to the Swiss guys tend to have a bit more of a all-around better athletic base. So the capacity to actually explore other avenues of training, like with the Swiss guys, we can do running, we can do cycling, we can do cross-country skiing and lots of other different things if we want to work on our kind of base aerobic physiology. Whereas that's probably slightly more limited in Britain. You couldn't send the guys out for an hour run compared to being able to do that with the Swiss guys. So
Do you think
there are some.
Sorry to cut you off. Do you think that's a
Sorry.
limitation on the British side to not have that the option to vary the training a little bit more, even just from a psychological standpoint?
Yeah, I think it does add a bit of a limitation. It's really interesting in Britain because Britain also has a very prolific talent ID program. So the Start Rowing program essentially pulls people that are maybe university-based age and have the anthropometry that's probably suited towards rowing. And they obviously tend to come from different sports. They might be ex-swimmers, ex-rugby players or whatever, and they chuck them onto a rowing machine, see that they can do some big numbers and try and teach them to row. And I think in the Rio cycle, it was something like we had 11 gold medalists that came from that Start program. So it's a very successful talent ID program. So I think that's the two avenues to being a high performance rower in Britain. You know, you've either done rowing at a very early age and performed at a good level and continued to make that pathway up to the Olympic level, or you've maybe been taken in from the talent ID perspective. But yeah, I think that is a little bit of a limitation, and I think for the schools programs in Britain probably should explore how they work on more general athleticism and exposing their rowers to other activities that's going to help them longer term in their rowing career, in my opinion.
And from the kind of the rowing style or the approach of training, like you were saying, is quite different between those two countries. Having experienced both now, do you see upsides and downsides to either of those approaches?
Yeah, both. I think, you know, if we took like the intensity-based model a little bit more from the Swiss side, there are some big advantages to that. I think in Britain, the model is very much like there's a lot of low rate type work. So, you know, like obviously yourself or someone who's trained quite a bit on the rowing machine, a lot of that is high force, high power, low rate type work, and then interspersed with a lot of low rate, steady state endurance training. That is the bread and butter of the British program. It's very simple. It is effective, obviously, because they're the most successful rowing nation ever, really. But I think having a little bit more exploration to some of those more intense zones for rowing is hugely beneficial. You know, it's not, the sport is intense. Like, yes, it's a 5 to 7 minute duration sport, but like you need a broad perspective of physical qualities. And the only way to be able to execute those high intensity, high rate, high endurance, high power type work is if you train it. So if you don't expose your athletes to that, then it's certainly more limiting. But I think on the flip side from the Swiss program, you know, maybe it can be a little bit more difficult to manage the training week. You know, in Britain, it's always very clear around, you'll have 1, maybe 2 really hot sessions a week, and that would be it. And you know you have to manage your. I always talk about like kind of managing a credit card. You know, you've got $200 on your credit card. How are you going to spend it across the week? You know, I can't spend $100 on a 15K steady state session. There's just no way, because otherwise I've got no money left for the rest of the week. And I think that concept fits quite well with the British model, that you know where the hot session is, and you know you're going to have to spend a lot of money on that session, despite having to spend your money nice and even across the rest of the week to get the training volume done. Whereas I think sometimes in Switzerland, there's not quite that same polarity. You know, every training is tough, every training is intense, but that also means that any session can be very fatiguing. So when you really want your guys to put the pedal down full, that can be sometimes hard to bring out. So yeah, pros and cons to both.
Is there maybe also that longevity advantage to better managing intensity throughout the week on the British side? Would you say, like, from a, you know, do rowers last longer in England than they do in Switzerland, to speak kind of harshly?
Yeah, I don't think necessarily. I think, you know, if we were talking about it from like an injury point of view, the model of injuries we get in Switzerland is very different to what I observed in the UK, which I think is really, really interesting. You I really should in the long term collate some of that information and pull it together. But there's so much other stuff that goes on. It's very difficult to do. But like, we certainly see, so there's kind of the big three in rowing is what I'd say. So backs, hips and ribs, that tends to be our three kind of key areas. And relatively in Switzerland, we see much more rib injuries than we do backs and hips. And in Britain, we've seen a lot more backs and hips than we do ribs. So maybe that's a reflection of the type of training model that is used. I think when, there are some really good studies looking at how that type of epidemiology has been collated in different national teams. So like the Aussies have done a really good study on how they've reported it across an Olympic cycle. I think that's really interesting. And Dr. Guy Evans, who used to work with the British team, was doing his, I can't remember if it was master's thesis or his PhD thesis, but looking at kind of the mechanisms behind some of the rib injuries. And that was, again, a really interesting way, and certainly still some of the work we use now. But yeah, it's really interesting that they do have different injury epidemiologies despite being in the same type of sport. And yeah, I think there wasn't this longevity in different ways. We've certainly seen less back problems, which tend to be more longitudinal in nature, whereas rib injuries, yes, once you have one, you're more likely to get one again. But if you do have a stress fracture or edema or whatever it might be on the bony point of the rib, then it can heal quite well, and you might not have one again in your career. Whereas a back or an overuse long-term back niggly hip can be a little bit more difficult to manage, and quite often in Britain would result in some surgical intervention, particularly when it came to hips. So yeah, it's really interesting.
When you talk about rib injuries, where do those usually come from?
So rib injuries, so it's categorized by kind of a chest wall pain. So I think it's 5th and 9th rib. I might have got that wrong. I have to double check on that. But ultimately what happens is, because of the high impact lat pulling force that happens during the kind of catch position of rowing, it's just like a progressive kind of overload of that structure. So, in running, for example, you'll see the same pattern emerge in stress fractures on the tibia or stress fractures around the foot. The really difficult thing with ribs is trying to categorize how, trying to really truly get a good diagnosis, because the spectrum of what it can be anywhere from like an edema, where there's just a little bit of swelling around that bony point, all the way to a full-blown, there's a clear fracture in the rib. You're going to need to leave time for that fracture to heal before you can start the process of reloading. So that's the thing that's really difficult to manage. I mean, the key thing is that, when you do experience chest wall pain, that you're able to identify it quickly rather than just ignore it, which is, again, when we go back to this rowing culture of, I just want to train through the pain, can be a bit of a problem to manage sometimes, because if they are struggling, they don't always like to speak up about it because they want to just crack on with training. So like, if you can catch it early, a short offload and a good progressive reintroduction can save you a lot of time. Whereas if you get to the point where you're in a lot of pain and it's quite clear that there's a fracture on the rib, then you're going to spend a long time out of the boat, and that's a 2 to 3 month process to get you fully integrated back to training. So
yeah, that makes sense. You were talking about rower profiles in the talent identification program in the UK. So what does an elite rower's profile look like?
Yeah, so if we're looking at the kind of talent ID side from the UK, they look at quite a few things. Most traditionally, that is kind of 3 key aspects. So one of those is obviously anthropometry. Rowers are tall and big. We know that. There are kind of certain thresholds that they look at, from wingspan and body height, that they try and use and say, okay, if you're female rower and you're a female and you're above, I can't remember what it is, it's like 5'10", 5'11", might even be, it could actually be 6 foot. Sorry, I can't remember the exact thresholds, but that's obviously one key area that they're going to look at in terms of identifying talent ID. There's then I don't know if you've ever seen the C2 strength dyno. So they don't make them anymore, but it's essentially kind of Concept 2's way, a couple of years ago, that you could do kind of like strength training with the rowing ergo. So you can do a leg press on it, you can do like a press, like a bench press style on it, and a pull as well. So they'd look at kind of peak forces and peak power outputs on those 3 different positions, and again have some kind of banding as to what is high potential versus low potential. And then they'd also do a aerobic test on the Schwinn bike, which is like the assault bike, so the arms and legs bike, to get a kind of base measure of what your aerobic capacity may be and whether you had the potential talent in that area. And obviously, if you were big, you had big power outputs, you had a big base physiology, then they'd be like, right, come in, we'll teach you to row, and hopefully try and make those steps through the pathway into becoming an elite rower. So it's very much done on that basis.
What's the interaction between, or the relationship, let's say, between that potential, really, because you're identifying potential within certain parameters, and then race outcomes, and then success on the water?
Yeah, well, that's the magic question, I think, Sean. I think how we started, traditionally how that's done is this linear basis. Like, you start from here, you get to this age, you get to here, you get to the elite level, and you get to here. But like, actually what that is quite a broad funnel, and that can very much fit within quite a big spectrum. So I think what they realized, actually, the further they worked down this, was actually to look at some other things. So like certain athletes, for example, if you're an ex-swimmer, you've got a lot of time in a sport where you've already been interacting with water. Like, you'll generally have quite a good feel as to what it's like to grip a rowing oar, and what it's like to understand how to propel yourself through water. So like, I think it became these type of things that started to add a little bit more level, because of course there were guys that were going to go into those type of talent ID programs, have huge numbers from a strength and power perspective, have a huge base engine, but actually could not move a boat for love nor money. Like, that's bound to happen. So yeah, I think it always got to the point where you could have someone that maybe had physiological talent, but then you'd make it 3 months down the line and realize, actually, this person doesn't have the know-how to transfer that truly into the boat. So it's probably a no in terms of taking them forward. But you don't know until you try, I guess. And I mean, it's hard to argue with it, because it's obviously been a very successful program, but there are huge limitations to doing this type of talent ID testing. I think even if I looked at a good friend of mine who's worked in skeleton, they're looking for ex-sprinters, ex-track and field athletes that could come and try out a Winter Olympic sport, where the start component of the sport is a maximal sprint for a couple of seconds and is hugely determinant on the result and outcome of getting down the track. But then what ultimately happens is, the ones that are very, very good at the sport tend to be the ones that are the phenomenal drivers, and they just happen to stumble across someone who could really drive the track like no one else. So yeah, it's really interesting as to how it sometimes plays out. You're looking for one thing, but actually you get something else entirely.
Yeah, for those who are listening and are probably more familiar with the concept too than with an actual boat, how different is it from being on the ergo when you're on the water with the oars in hand and having to manage moving a boat through water?
Yeah, definitely. I probably have to be careful with how much I talk about this, because I'm not a personal rower, and I'm sure some of my athletes will give me a lot of stick if I don't if I elaborate too much about the water side of things. But yeah, there are definitely things that are quite different. I mean, if we look at rowing as a whole, rowing is a very much a kind of impulse-driven sport. So compared to cycling, uphill cycling, which is very more kind of power to weight based, that the weight is going to be a big factor. Actually, the impact of body weight on rowing can be quite negligible. Obviously, you can't be 130 kilos and just sit in a boat, but like, the bandwidth of what we can play with from a body weight perspective is much higher. So there's a very traditional saying in rowing, which is ergs don't float, which is kind of true. But I think the thing you have to consider, like how I look at it, is in two parts. So one of that is that propulsive impulse mechanic that we talked about, which is, are you gripped in the boat? Do you produce force through your legs, hips, trunk and arms to propel the boat? And then what do you do in the boat to not slow the run of the boat down? That's the kind of skill element towards it. So there's a couple of things to consider. One is to, on that point where you're propelling the boat, is, am I actually well connected or not? Because you can pull a very big score on the C2 erg, but a lot of that you can manipulate with your own body weight. But in rowing, it's a little bit different. As soon as you take that out on the water, you have to be able to understand and apply power at the right time. So the timing element becomes really critical. And then it's that second element that you don't have on the C2, which is what you do with your body to get yourself back into the catch position for rowing is then very important. Because if you disrupt how the boat runs or your body weight shifts around too much, actually you really kill how the boat is going to move through the water. And it ends up being like, you put a big push in, but then the boat moves and then it checks and doesn't really go anywhere. Whereas you want to keep that boat running as smoothly as possible. So yeah, there's definitely quite a big difference, but like the C2 is still a very important tool from a physiological perspective for monitoring athletes as to what they're gonna look like, and it's used widely throughout rowing still, even to the point where it becomes a selection tool. There are certain age groups and bandings that are going to select off C2 performance alone. So it's still very important, but yeah, I mean, it's not the be all and end all ultimately.
Right. Have you had any experience, or maybe your rowers, have they had any experience using the RP3? Because I know that's another indoor model that is pretty popular, especially in the more elite realms of rowing. So could you give an idea of the comparison between the two? Mm-hmm. I guess off a second-hand knowledge.
Yeah, sure. So RP3 again is a very useful tool. It's fairly recent in development. We've actually got a few RP3 models which we have used quite a bit. So the key difference is obviously with the C2 that the head element is static, so the seat and the chain kind of move up and down, whereas the RP3, the head element actually moves backwards and forwards, and that's kind of a little bit more simulating as to how the boat would move underneath you. So there's an element of specificity with the RP3 that's a little bit higher. What it's really great for is actually looking at, it gives you a lot of different metrics. So you can kind of look at your total impulse of the force applied, your peak power output, the length in which you're rowing. You get a really nice illustration of how the force curve is looking. And that gives you really good biomechanical feedback that you can actually make some decent technical changes off. So that's certainly where kind of our coaching team has looked at that and how it's been used is to go, okay, well, this is what we're maybe looking for as a crew. This is kind of where you are. This is where you are. How can we blend your patterns to make something a little bit more conducive and a little bit more balanced to put a crew together? So yeah, it's been a really useful tool. I think the key thing with the C2 is that the reliability of the machine is so high. Like the models, when you compare one C2 to another C2 to another C2, like there's barely any difference between them. Compared that from what we found with the RP3 is that the reliability is a little bit lower and it seems to differ a little bit more across machines. So yeah, there's certainly some disadvantages and advantages to both.
Yeah, that's one thing definitely that I've found over the last few years, looking at different, let's say, endurance or cardio modalities, for lack of a better term. The Concept 2 machines seem to have, the calibration seems to be just off the charts in terms of, like I said, machine to machine, where pretty much every other modality, you look at the assault bikes, you look at any other, most of the other tools on the market, you're always going to see some differences from one unit to the other, which can be a problem, right? When you're looking to track things in a very precise and specific way.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you. It's just there's something so finely tuned about the C2 that it's exactly why it's a tool that's used so widely, and for other models of rowing simulating devices that have kind of come onto the market, just haven't been able to break into it. Previously, so the C2 did used to have a dynamic model, which did something similar to the RP3, but I think there were definitely some issues around the longevity of the device. So because there was the components of what it's made out of, I think there's like a cable kind of string element that tended to fray over use. So I was aware of some clubs in Britain that were solely using the dynamic ones, but then just like ended up getting rid of them, selling them, and replacing them with a flock of static ones, just because of the reliability aspect and the wear and tear of them. Yeah, there's something very special about them, I think, for some coaches.
Yeah, it seems when you can, when Eddie Hall can sit on it and just pull the handle as hard as he can, you know that the thing is durable, right?
100%. Yeah, definitely.
So shifting a little bit to maybe the bread and butter of what you do, if you could talk about how a week of training is laid out for your rowing team, or your team of rowers, and maybe kind of briefly touch on the rowing specific sessions, and then go into a bit more detail on the physical preparation side of things and what you add to maybe the water or the specific boat training that they have.
Yeah, definitely. Rowing is a pretty kind of grim training program. So for our guys, they actually come into the training center 5 days a week. So they have 2 days a week at home. One of those days is like an off day, and then the other day is generally a training day where they might have a session on the rowing machine that they have to do in the club, or a weight session to do in the club, or whatever it might be. Then for the rest of the week, you're mainly looking at 3 sessions a day. So we're looking at a session content probably around 16 training sessions per week, kind of on average. So it's pretty grim, to be honest. A typical training day would look something like a row normally in the morning. So that's mainly because of the quality of the water is generally going to be better and flatter in the morning. Certainly at our training center, that's the case. It depends which kind of lake you're around and whereabouts in the world you are. But generally the water is going to be better at that time.
Where's the training center in Switzerland?
So the training center is in Sarnen. So it's like 20 minutes from Lucerne. Okay. Really, really nice place. Like, it's an incredible lake. I couldn't believe it when I first rocked up. It's unbelievable. But it's a pretty special place. I think for the athletes, they probably take it for granted a little bit these days that they do so much hard training on that lake, but they forget sometimes that they're probably on the best training lake in the world, or arguably one of the best in the world.
Nice.
So it's typically a row in the morning. The middle session might end up being another row. It might end up being a alternative aerobic session, or something like that. And then generally it's normally a weight session at the back end of the day. So that's like a typical meaty kind of training day, and what that's going to look like. So obviously my biggest input is with the weight side of things. So for most of the guys on a normal training week, we're normally doing 3 weight sessions a week. Most of our programming is centered around developing maximal rowing power. So that being kind of the key outcome on the broader perspective of the program, and then the underpinning factors towards that. So, maximal strength, rate of force development, hypertrophy, lean muscle mass, that's going to also be influential on those qualities. And that's what most of the gym training is centered around, is quite traditional strength training.
Yeah. So if we're talking about three weight training sessions a week, how are those usually structured? Are you taking a full body approach? Is it some kind of split? How do you work with that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mix. So, depending on the time of the year and what that's going to look like, I'll use a couple of different splits. But generally, they're mostly full body sessions across the week. If I do use a split, it might be because there's certain sessions on in the midweek, and maybe I want the second session to have a little bit less sting. So I might just stick to an upper body based session on that and focus a little bit more on the lower body at both ends of the week. Or if I'm in, depending on what kind of block is within the season, then that might be a little bit more of a power emphasis on the last session of the week. So, working, just working things like ollie lifts or loaded jumps and throws or whatever it might be, that might go towards the back end of the week, particularly as quite often the hotter session of the week will be around the Saturday or Sunday, where they might do pieces out on the water, and you kind of want to prime them and prep them a little bit for that session. But yeah, it's generally going to be full body. I tend to use like a couple of key lower body lifts a week. So I quite like the guys to maybe do, either like a heavy squat or a heavy trap bar deadlift alongside like another deadlift, or it might be a rack pull or something like that. I try and keep 2 good lower body strength stimuluses in there as kind of a key exercise area. And, depending on the time of the year and the person and all the other kind of contextual based stuff, that's going to fill the other elements of the program. So
you talked about loaded jumps. Is there a place in a Rose program for any type of plyometric work? Is that something that can be incorporated or has to be? Is it an important factor as well?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So what you tend to see from rowers is that, if we're talking kind of pure plyometrically, what you see from like a soft tissue interaction and how rowers use that is so poor. It's unbelievable. If you ever want to do something to get a bit of comedic value, you can watch a rower do something like a drop jump. It's possibly the slowest thing you'll ever see in your life. But the capacity for a rower to use that kind of soft tissue mechanism, that plyometric mechanism, is often quite limited. But what I tend to do is focus a little bit more on concentric-based outcome jumps. So, there'll be things like box jumps, there'll be things like seated counter movement jumps. Even I do use things like depth jumps every now and again, even some kind of band-assisted stuff, and certainly focusing on more loaded power work, generally because the difference between what you might see a rower do a jump spot with a bar on the back and a standard counter movement jump is almost indifferent. So you might as well add a little bit of load in there. But yeah, we definitely, there is some value to using jumps and including that. And I think for a lot of rowers like that, I think I was listening to a podcast you did with William Wayland, and he hit this really well. In terms of golfers, it's like there's a general lack of base athleticism that can sometimes come from just being sport-specific training for so long and so early into the sport. And yeah, I know we talked about it a little bit differently from the Swiss guys, but you still see that in rowers, that they do struggle with some of those explosive base movements. So there is an element that you do want to train it. Whether we're talking about including very fast contact type plyometric work with rowers, I'm not sure. It's something I'd actually quite like to look at, because there are some guys, I think some of the science and rowing guys did a nice little presentation of a study that looked at some kind of pure plyometric training and the impact of that on kind of peak power outputs, and whether that would actually translate for some of the more elite end rowers, I'm not too sure, but it's something I'm going to have to explore, I think, in the future.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting part. And like you said, even from a general standpoint, it might be that thing that gives a slightly broader base to the athlete to then build those specific requirements on top of it. Yeah,
for sure. I think when we, like I said to you before, rowing is not hugely time constrained in terms of it's about impulse. It's the volume. You've got a time zone that isn't limited by trying to do something in a very short space of time. Like, if we're talking about striking, for example, where you've got a fraction of a second to produce a movement, rowing is much more longer duration than that, and you've got a lot of time, and therefore you have to produce large amounts of force. So there's no real constraint on the sport compared to, if we're looking at something like sprinting, for example, in a lot of field-based sports where you really need those quick, short contacts and you need to be really efficient at them. There's just not that constraint in rowing. So that's the kind of flip side to the argument, as you go, well, is that stuff even going to be beneficial? But yeah, it's still something I'd actually like to explore for the same reason that you just said, just in terms of giving it that base level to explore an avenue of specific training on the top.
Mm-hmm. And going back to the weekly, kind of the weekly layout and those strength training sessions or sessions in the gym, how does that change across a training year or even another big cycle towards the big competitions?
Yeah, sure. So this is kind of one of the advantages of rowing is you can be quite block natured with the way that you think. Certainly if you're working in, I've worked in the elite rugby kind of environment previously, and the game day preparation ultimately is paramount. Like whatever you do in the week, you have to make sure you're prepared for Saturday. That's everything else is just extra to what you can do. And yeah, you can do some annual planning, but like the structure of Tuesday being your kind of main lift strength-based day and Thursday being your more speed preparation type session, that almost isn't going to change throughout the year. Whereas in rowing, we can certainly think a little bit more block-based. Ultimately, there's one event in a season that these guys have got to be prepared for, and that's either a World Championships or an Olympic Games. And everything you're doing from a physical preparation perspective is catered towards that. So, if I take the outcome from just the strength training, weight training side, ultimately I want to prepare the guys for being able to produce a high amount of peak power. That's where weight training is going to have the most impact. We know that's a key kind of correlate to 2K performance. It's that, there's a lot of elements that having a big peak power is going to change from a rowing performance perspective, even from the rowing economy side of things. Like it's the same when we talk about kind of that speed reserve. If I can, if my average race is at 450 watts, but my maximum capacity is 800 watts, if I increase that ceiling to 1,000, actually to do that 450 is going to be much more efficient. So, that's a real big part of it too. So, that's really the kind of key outcome at the end of the year from my side. And preceding that is often more of the, that kind of speed power based training. So that's where I'm going to be using more of my Olympic lifts, the loaded jumps, using kind of lower percentage 1RM type lifts for speed emphasis. So things like banded deadlifts and, squat from pins and this kind of stuff where we're focusing a bit more on the velocity based element of what they're doing in the gym. Preceding that is going to be, in the late winter, early season time is going to be more kind of maximal strength based. So, I'll use a couple of different methods. I might use kind of a mini triphasic block leading into that final kind of max strength bit, or I might use things, this is more often when I might use things like clusters and this kind of stuff, where we're ultimately trying to work high intensity outputs in the gym, but being careful with how much volume we throw at the guys in the gym. And then the preceding element to that is kind of in the early winter time, where I'm going to be working a little bit more, I say kind of hypertrophy, but like a lot of that is about giving them a base kind of strength volume. For some guys, that is going to be very specific to hypertrophy. There'll be some guys in the winter that maybe end up doing 5 weight sessions a week rather than 3, where a key goal might be actually we need to pack some more muscle on this person. So that's going to be typically, more variety in training, working a lot more accessory kind of lifts and trying to build some capacity and volume to then transfer to max strength, transfer to peak power. So I've got quite a traditional kind of approach with that, but that's the kind of beauty of rowing, is that you can be a little bit more block periodized with the way you think about it. So yeah.
When you talk about working on the speed training side of things, do you use gym aware or anything else to quantify velocities that the guys might be outputting in the gym?
Yeah, so we use the push bands. I'd actually really like to use it more, and to be honest, I haven't used it enough yet. It's just like it's one of those things that just requires a little bit of management and preparation beforehand, and I probably need to get on top of that. But it's tended to be with a couple of individuals that I've used it with a little bit more. But yeah, it's definitely a good tool. I think the thing you have to consider with rowers is that the velocity bandings can be a little bit different just because of who they are. Like you can't, I think it's Brian Mann has some phenomenal literature on kind of velocity-based training, and he set some really nice thresholds for different exercises and and that kind of stuff. But like for some of the rowers, sometimes you have to look at it completely differently because the velocities just don't always fit what they actually do, just because they're such slow twitch kind of based athletes. But yeah, it's a really useful tool, and definitely something I'm trying to integrate a little bit more into the future.
Is there any room in that kind of more the strength or power training for some really explosive pulling motions with the upper body that might transfer then to the rowing stroke?
Yeah, I played around with this quite a bit actually. So trying to use things like kind of plyometric, like based inverted rows, banded bent over rows, banded bench pulls, this kind of stuff I've tried to play around with a little bit actually to see if we can find that. And I think there is some benefit there. I think the key thing you have to consider is kind of how much the upper body plays as a factor in the rowing stroke itself. Like I said, it's not like the motion of the upper body and to when the upper body kicks in. It's really the last kind of last quarter of the stroke where it starts to have any impact on kind of force. And by that point, if you haven't got the other 75% of the force curve right, you can kind of forget about it. Like if you haven't got a decent connection through your trunk, if you haven't got a nice fast leg drive and a nice explosive hip opening, like the arm involvement is a little bit negligible. But I've really liked it from like a peaking perspective. I think it adds a little bit of something different for these guys, that they're not just always doing long, slow movements. And I've tried to play around with it. It's just like explosive upper body pulling. It's quite logistically difficult to do. Yeah. Like when it comes to pushing, it's really obvious. You can throw a projectile. You have this motion where you fully let go. Whereas as soon as you do anything pulling, your body's kind of in the way. So it's a little bit more difficult. But that's where the bands and stuff like that come into play. And I'd like to get some chains actually and play around with the same kind of mechanic and do the same thing. But yeah, it's a really cool one.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like you said, logistically it's not easy. And I was just imagining kind of one of those inverted leg presses. So just the rail, and you put a handle on the rail, and you get to push it and then pull it as fast as you can and then let it go in a bent over position. Yeah. Which might mimic a kind of a throwing motion with the pushing aspect of the upper body. But yeah, like you said, you'd have to invent a machine or DIY your way through it, which isn't always the most practical thing to do, especially when you're working with a big team of athletes.
Definitely not.
Right.
I think there's that. I think there is that. Yeah, you're right. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think also the other consideration is like, so particularly with some of my female athletes, I try and keep some good volume-based training in the upper body throughout the year, just because like upper body mass on females tends to be quite a limiting factor for a lot of female rowers. Like it tends to be the area that you see fatigue first. Ultimately, depending on how the boat is rigged, the force and power outputs that are required for the sport are very similar to what male athletes need, and females tend to have naturally a lower level of upper body development. So for me, it's really important to keep some of that volume in the upper body through the females almost throughout the year. So yeah, that then goes, well, how much time do I want to spend working upper body explosive versus upper body maintaining mass becomes another factor to kind of throw into the equation.
Mm-hmm. When you get younger athletes moving through the development categories and then into the national team, what are the biggest differences that they're going to experience when it comes to the training regime that they'll encounter there?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is obviously the frequency. It's difficult because on one hand, I sometimes question in rowing whether, do we just push guys to do more training unnecessarily? Like, can we think more optimally about our time that we used? But on the other hand, you look at rowing as a sport, and there is no one at the highest level who has not trained hard to get there and trained a lot to get there. There's no sneaking around that rowing is physiologically a sport that's pushed to the limit, and you need to be very fit, very strong, very powerful to compete at the highest level of the sport. And in order to do that, you need to do a lot of training. You need to do a lot of quality training, and you need to do a lot of intense training. Mm. And that is the biggest thing for a young athlete coming through the pathway, is once you get to the level where you're competing for your national team, is the training frequency is much higher, and you've got to be prepared to tolerate that. So, from my side, a lot of the messaging for the junior and younger athletes in the system is more kind of health-based. If I think about training camps, I'm looking more towards an educational perspective. Is okay, can I give these guys the movement tools? Do they first have the base movement capacity to handle themselves in a gym? Can I then give them that base level of strength training knowledge to hugely add some protective qualities that when they come to doing more frequency of rowing training, that they can tolerate it a little bit more? That becomes hugely important. So yeah, that's the biggest thing. It's that change in training frequency and the sacrifice you have to make to be able to do that in your day-to-day life. When it's 3 sessions a day every day and you're a full-time athlete, it's pretty tough. It's completely consuming. That is entirely a full-time job and more. When you include all the other stuff you have to do, like the amount of time these guys spend eating throughout the day, and I'd include things like taking naps and recovery and that kind of stuff is also inclusive in that, and that is part of your training regime. So it goes, if you've got 5 to 6 hours worth of training, you've still got actually 8 to 9 hours worth of total time when you include everything else.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Is strength training part of the culture enough in rowing that when you get the young guys, they're already acquainted with the all the basic patterns and proficient enough to kind of bail on that, or do you have to start from scratch with them?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mix, to be honest. So what was traditionally done in rowing probably 10, 11 years ago, I think that's been hugely influential from the British team, in my opinion. I think so Alex Wolff, who was the head of strength and conditioning for the British team in the Rio Games, so he was then head of strength and conditioning for the EIS after that, and is now doing some kind of consultancy on his own time. But in terms of a guy really changing the culture of a sport, I really felt like Wolfie introduced a big strength training culture that has kind of gone international, not just specific to Britain. It really evolved internationally. And what was traditionally done is generally like more circuit type training, always very high rep, 5 by 20 reps of bench pulls, 6 minutes worth of bench pulls or squats or whatever it might be. And this element of strength and power training didn't really exist, and it's slowly morphed. And I think now most rowers recognize how important it is to be strong and powerful in the sport of rowing, and that can be very influential on your 2K performance. And I think when I first started in Switzerland, there were less guys doing that. And I think the more time I've spent with each cycle of juniors that's kind of gone through, the base level always is a little bit better each time, and more people are more competent around the gym and kind of understand strength training as a premise, and also kind of how to execute it as well, which is really, really promising. And it makes my life a lot easier. It makes their integration into becoming the next step to making the next step up the pathway much easier as well. So yeah, it's really interesting, and it's still a bit of a mix. I think traditionally what you might see out of the French and the Italians is still this type of circuit training based thing. So, most of the guys that don't do much strength training as juniors tend to be the ones that come from the kind of Swiss Romandy area, because there's more of a French influence on the rowing coaches on that side. So, whereas, the guys in the Swiss central part are more influenced by the Germans, which are pushing more of a traditional strength-based model. So really typical, really, that it starts to play out like that.
Now that we've talked about let's call it the structural aspect of training, if we were to go to the energetic side, I'm interested in hearing you talk about the power duration models that you guys have been using for profiling and zoning with your athletes. So if we could go into that.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Since I kind of started, really, we've been using this kind of power duration based modeling, and how that manifests is into looking at values of critical power and our W prime. But actually kind of using those to generate some kind of physiological benchmarks, but two, also how we use those variables to then program our physiological training. So obviously, like, I guess with kind of power duration stuff, what's traditionally done is kind of lab-based testing for most rowers. So it's normally like, you might be doing the VO2 max, you might be doing a lactate kind of step test. And power duration, while it's kind of used a lot more in cycling, definitely, and I guess maybe critical speed model in running, which is essentially the same kind of premise, it's not used a lot at all in rowing. And I guess, so like talking from the history of it, what used to be kind of used in cycling was these time to exhaustion trials. So it'd be like, okay, Sean, we're going to do 3 fixed power output trials. I'm going to ask you to hold that power output for as long as possible, and then we're going to record your time to fatigue, which is, when you've got to do multiple versions of that test, is pretty grim, to be honest, and hence it didn't get stuck around for so often, because it's quite from a practical standpoint, it's a pretty grim test to throw at your athletes. But so what the guys, certainly the guys in kind of British cycling, a huge amount of research from Andrew Jones at Exeter University, they looked at fixed time trials. So, it might be a 12-minute, 6.5-minute, and a 3-minute or something like that. And what you end up doing is plotting your average power output against the test length of the trial. And we draw this nice kind of hyperbolic relationship. And we assume that there is a hyperbolic relationship between duration and power. And and then you get this power duration graph. That's what we then use to do a lot of our programming. So from the graph, we look at our critical power, which is kind of that asymptote point of the curve. So once you've drawn that curve, so in mathematics, it's kind of the point where the curve never quite touches down. And that's kind of representative of our critical power. And then we've also got the area between the curve and above the asymptote. That's going to be representative of our W prime. And what we end up doing is taking those values and kind of comparing them to the group, but also kind of using those values to program different training zones and different kind of target power outputs for the guys to do for certain sessions. So.
And so how does this profiling impact the programming for the guys? Could you give maybe 2 concrete examples of 2 very different profiles and how their respective training looks?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I still, and we still use as a team, the kind of traditional model in a way of physiology, kind of looking at critical power being our benchmark of our primarily aerobic stuff. I feel like if Evans listens to this, he's probably gonna kill me, but that's still a thought process for a lot of our coaches. So I still have to operate in that kind of manner. And then we try and think of our W prime as more of our kind of anaerobic tank. So, I could have an athlete, for example, that has the same 2K score, but one athlete could have relatively a much lower critical power and a much higher W prime, whereas another athlete could have a much higher critical power and a much lower W prime. So actually, for them to achieve the same performance output is very, very different. And that means we have to think about how we target where there might be limitations and weaknesses into their program. So what we tend to do is, so we have anything from kind of 0 to 2 individual sessions per week. Certainly at the early part of the cycle, at the Olympic cycle, this would be 2 individual based sessions. So if I've got a guy who's got quite low critical power, for example, it might be 2 kind of base aerobic sessions that they're working on. If I had a guy that was very low W prime and maybe low on the peak power output side, then they might have been spending extra time in the gym to pack on a bit more muscle mass, improve their power output, whatever it might be. But however, the rest of the week might still look dissimilar, because obviously if you're working in crew boats, you can't be doing 2 separate training sessions at the same time. It doesn't always work like that in rowing. So it's very difficult to balance this element of individualization and what you are going to need to develop the technical qualities and the other skills that you're going to need for the sport. So yeah, it's really interesting. And then I guess further down the line, how we've also used that is actually going, right, we'll use the one individual session as a really hot session. Mm-hmm. And for example, if I've got someone who's very low on the critical power side. We might use kind of longer duration, high intensity intervals that are going to use a greater proportion of critical power to try and work on that critical power ceiling. Whereas if I've got a guy who's maybe a little bit lower on the W prime side, we might use shorter duration, kind of high intensity intervals with shorter turnaround and repeats to try and work on my ability to delete my W prime or deplete my W prime and rebuild and deplete and rebuild. So that's like just a little example of kind of how we've used it from that side of things. I think the key thing obviously is, you know, we still mainly follow quite a polarized training method. So the majority of the programming is, even on the rowing machines and the C2 when they're training at home, a lot of that is still kind of base steady state. So getting something a little bit more accurate to kind of quantify what my steady state zone is going to look like to do most of my endurance based training on the ergometer is also important. And obviously the values of critical power, we can use percentages of that to figure that out. So yeah, so it's got a couple, it adds quite a lot, in my opinion, to our programming. It's actually, you know, compared to what I've seen it in other aspects of rowing, I feel like we use the physiological profiling quite a lot to actually influence the programming. And sometimes that's not always done in rowing. It's a case of like, oh, your VO2 max is this, or oh, your power at 2 millimole is this, great. But then how you actually use that for interventions is a little bit more limited.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I guess the field as a whole is slowly going towards those more individual profiling methods, whether it's with the critical power model that you just outlined, or we've been talking a lot about the Moxie and how that could be used to potentially profile athletes to inform training. But like you said, using stuff like VO2, which as a value in and of itself doesn't actually bring much in terms of being able to plan off. And so, like you said, bringing that individualization. Do you feel like, and again, there are those constraints of you have to be in a boat, there's more than one person for most of the events. Do you feel like there might be a benefit to increasing the number of individual sessions throughout the week for the athletes, or what is the feedback from the athletes on that usually?
Yeah, I think as a general concept, it's surprising how little exposure that a lot of rowers have to individualized training. And I felt like the general feedback and the conception of it has actually been really good, that we are considering, you know, where those limitations are, where those strengths are, what we're going to work on where and when. And it seems like a no-brainer to me that that should be a part of the athlete profile. And I can't for the life of me figure it out in rowing as to why traditionally it's not really done that much. I think a lot of it stems down to the culture of the sport. Is to, like, you know, it's a very coach-driven culture, and, you know, a coach has a program, they feel strongly about what their program is and what it brings, and they don't want too much deviation away from what that's going to be. Whereas, you know, certainly some of the guys that I've worked with are very open about the fact that a program is not perfect. You know, there's a lot of specifics in a program that's going to determine what you're going to do at any one time. And there's more than enough ways to skin a cat in the sporting world to get different programs that can ultimately result in very similar performance outcomes. So yeah, it's really interesting. I think, you know, going back to your question, I think there is definitely scope to do a little bit more from an individualization perspective. I think the key thing that you have to balance, though, is, you know, a lot of the culture that we do around having a centralized environment is that sessions are competitive. You know, you're working side by side. Okay, you're against each other to some degree, not for every session, because some sessions are about you working on your own things, but like there's an element of competitiveness that you have to bring into the environment. And if you've got one guy doing something completely different, another guy going off a completely different tangent, you've got no, what's the word?
Common drive, maybe?
But yeah, common drive, yeah, something like that pulls everyone together. It's very hard to have a very high functioning team environment. And I guess you know, if you took like rugby, for example, if you just had the backs and the forwards split the whole session, you know, full back and fly half is just kicking goals all session. Like you got the wingers just doing some sprints. You got 3 of the front row just working on their scrummaging, the rest of the guys working on lineouts for the whole session. It just wouldn't work. At some point, you've got to, yes, you need those individual components and your specialized areas need to work on certain things, but you've got to pull it together at some point. So it's about getting that balance right. And to be perfectly honest with you, Sean, I don't know what that balance would be, but I think there is scope to do a little bit more. Yeah.
If we went maybe a little bit further into that reflection, I know that the Olympics are close now. You're in the last year of the cycle, hoping that it all goes through obviously this year. If we talk about next year and maybe a bit more freedom to try things, if you had the liberty of adding or trying a few things out with the team, where would you take it?
Yeah, I think I mean, me and you have obviously had a lot of discussions around, certainly a lot of the thinking that guys like Andre and Evan have put forward as to how we work on physiological limitations. I think some integration with that would be really, really interesting. I think getting the basic testing that we do now, power duration it's very cheap, it's very easy. You get, certainly at the elite level, you get very, very reliable data. But like we're not taking any internal measures of what is going on within the body. And I think, we've seen, and certainly some of the interventions that we've discussed around training for respiratory limitations is that actually these can be very effective methods to improving our performance. And I think, if it was up to me and I had a bit more flexibility and time with the guys to do that, I'd like to explore some of those methods as to how we clearly get a good diagnosis and then how we actually put together those training protocols to work on those limitations. But I do also think one of the things we've thought about a lot recently is, I think in the sports science world and certainly in the strength and conditioning world, we're so focused on limitations and weaknesses that we don't consider what these guys have as strengths. And I think that's so important. It's like, there's a reason these guys are at the top of their performance, and it's not because their weaknesses are shit. It's because they've definitely got something that's making them an elite and a top performer. And I think it's important to consider that as well, as actually go within that physiological profiling, actually, what is this guy really good at? Because I think for a lot of athletes, it tends to be the thing that they enjoy training. It tends to be the thing that's going to give them confidence before a key competition. And it also tends to be the thing that physiologically is going to be the quickest thing to change and add a bigger thing too, because they've already got a predisposition to being able to do that. So I think that's important as well, is to add those things in. Yeah,
almost what came to mind when you said that is just to polarize the training in that aspect as well, where you focus on your strength and on your weaknesses, and you kind of push at both ends of the spectrum instead of just staying in the middle and doing a little bit of everything. But like you said, address the low-hanging fruit, but also drive the training from the front of the boat, so to speak. And like you said, from a psychological 100%. Standpoint, it's a lot easier for the guys to work on the things they're good at than what they're not.
Yeah, it's funny. I just think sometimes I just thought it was worth putting out there because, like, I think in this world we focus so much on like limitations and weaknesses, which of course is important and important areas to develop. But like, we don't always go, actually, what's this guy really good at? It's a bit like saying, okay, Usain Bolt's going to run the 400 meters. Are we going to do a load of high intensity endurance training with him? Probably. He probably needs to do a little bit, but like, we know he's got blistering pace and he's got exceptional speed, and that's going to be the thing that's going to actually win him that event, not necessarily just grinding out loads of endurance training to make up for the lack of endurance that he might have at the moment. So yeah, I don't know. It's an extreme example, but like, it's just a stupid anecdote I was just thinking of in my head.
I think it makes a lot of sense. Is there anything from the athlete standpoint that you work with that they're interested in digging into, or that they've kind of brought to you through the last few months or even years, as to where they might see maybe an opening or a white space to explore within training?
Yeah, I think bits and bobs, like it really has kind of depended on the athlete. Is to, certain athletes that have a kind of deeper interest within sport, and maybe within sports science specifically, and looking physiologically, you know, there's one athlete in particular that certainly tweaked my mind, and, you know, part of the reason me and you started having a little bit of collaboration and some of the things I was picking your brains about, I think, and I think that's really cool, to be honest. I think sometimes we don't give the athletes enough accountability, and we don't always listen to them enough, and we should make sure we take the time to do that. And yeah, you know, that athlete in particular has been also a COVID rehab athlete, and has struggled with his respiratory system, and I think is seeing some good benefits is to doing that respiratory specific training to impact his overall performance. You know, not just bring him back to a healthy state, but actually try and make those performance gains on top of it. So that's a really good example. You know, other athletes are interested in different fields. Like, you know, I have one athlete who's really interested in kind of the mobility conditioning side of things, and, you know, she has a really big input into what she feels she needs from a health perspective, and what needs to go into her session preparation. And, you know, we work together on that, and, you know, it's a different kind of approach, but it's important that you listen to your athletes and what they want. I think you have to balance a bit of that, but I think on the flip side of that, you also have to consider is that sometimes the training that you need to do is not what you want to do. And that's also like what you've got to keep at the back of your mind. Like, the training you need might not be what you want, but you got to do it if you want to make the steps to the next level. So yeah, a bit of a balancing act again on those points.
Yeah, like you said, going back to finding the happy middle ground between what you want to do, what you think you need, and at the end of the day, you still need to put in the reps. You still need to put in the time and the work.
Yeah,
if you want to, you know, make it at the highest level.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's one of those where it's like, oh, it sounds really nice and it's a lovely recipe to have, but I've got no idea what the exact proportions are of those. Like, I mean, anyone who does must have Olympic champions coming out of their ears, because, you know, I couldn't tell you. I can't sit there and be like, oh yeah, Sean, a perfect environment, it works like this. There's so many constraints and kind of contextual variables that make up what approach you're going to take there. I mean, the key thing is, like, actually as a practitioner, having the nous to go into the environment, have a look at what's going on, and then doing something that's going to fit that, rather than just going, oh, I'm just going to do it this way because that's the only way that I know. It's like, come in, observe, formulate a bit of a plan, and start to then begin to make changes off that, rather than just running in deer in the headlights type thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned the respiratory training that you've been doing or starting to explore with some of the athletes. I know you and I have been talking a lot about this in the last few weeks, and how it pertains to performance. So from your current perspective, where do you see that element of training being able to assist your rowers in their performance in the future?
Yeah, so it's I should probably start by, like, you know, until really a couple of months ago when we started talking about it, I really had this kind of base impression that, you know, breathing training itself is, the body's going to do what's best. The body will figure it out. Don't worry about it. But, like, I don't think my perception of it could have been more distorted. And I think I've definitely observed how that can change. And I think, like, just because it's also regulated, don't fall into the trap that it can't be trained. I think, you know, when we've had conversations in the past, you really hit the nail on the head when we discussed around, like, the respiratory system is underpinned still by some muscle function, and muscle function can be a limitation for the performance. So if you don't train it, your respiratory system is going to be limited, and ultimately, if your respiratory system is limited, then what you're going to be able to do from a high performing endurance perspective is also going to be limited. So yeah, I think for me, for those athletes that specifically have those limitations, if we're able to kind of find a really nice protocol that clearly identifies that, and we're then able to use some of those breathing training methods as interventions, it can be really cheap gains. Like, those respiratory training sessions, they're not, okay, yeah, they have to fit into an overall plan, of course, but, like, they're not massively taxing sessions. You know, it's something very easily we can integrate, and you know, even if it doesn't work, you haven't lost a huge amount. But like, I think it can definitely have some impact. You know, particularly when it comes to rowing being such a kind of finely tuned elite endurance sport. There's bound to be athletes that have those respiratory limitations, and there's bound to be athletes that are going to benefit from just isolating that component of their training.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. And one thing that's kind of sticking out for me more and more is this idea of the metabolic reflex of the respiratory system. For those who are not familiar with the idea, is that your brain is going to safeguard in that hierarchically, it's going to safeguard your brain, your vital organs, your diaphragm as the main respiratory muscle. Because if you don't breathe, you die. It's that simple. And then locomotor muscles, and then non-involved muscles in that order. And so once the respiratory system or diaphragm in general gets fatigued, what you are going to see is a centrally mediated vasoconstriction of the locomotor limbs to actually shuttle blood back into the trunk and into the diaphragm and the respiratory muscles to make sure that they keep moving, because otherwise you're going to die again. And I've even recently read some papers on respiratory interventions that they did on female soccer players, and even in the constraints of a repeat sprint test, which is probably the farthest thing from to go back to our quotation marks, aerobic demanding activity or aerobically demanding activity. They saw significant improvements in repeat sprint ability through a very, very simple respiratory protocol. And so, yeah, again, my mind just goes to if this can have such a big impact on a non-endurance sport, what could be potentially the positive repercussions on a heavily endurance reliant sport like rowing?
Certainly, yeah, certainly. It's really the same school of thought I've been thinking about, certainly over the past kind of couple of weeks and few months. I feel like it seems like a no-brainer to me from a intervention perspective, is that it could be very cheap, easy gains to be made. So yeah, it'd be cool to see. Looking forward to seeing how that's kind of going to progress. Certainly over time, certainly over the next Olympic cycle, even as to how that's going to look. So yeah, it's going to be cool.
You mentioned one of your athletes going through some post-COVID rehab on the respiratory side. So have you been able to find any positive effects there so far?
Yeah, I think so. Briefly, kind of looking at the data, so we've been using the IDIAG P100 as our kind of main respiratory training tool. And the really good thing about the IDIAG is that it gives you a lot of kind of feedback within session. You can really kind of mediate some of the volumes that you might want to be doing, and also within the app adds a little bit of a testing element as well. I think already we've seen some improvements in those kind of base metrics, which is really good.
Are you able to talk about which metrics that was in terms of where you saw differences?
Yeah, so I think on the IDIAG, I forget the term that they use, but it's just like volume. I think on the IDIAG, I forget that they just have like a volume-based metric, don't they? That does like total volume or total capacity. I don't know if that's exactly comparable to FVC. But yeah, you might know a little bit more than that on my side. But
I believe that's what it is. Yeah, I believe when you do the respiratory assessment on the volume section of the app, I believe that is the equivalent for FVC that they're measuring, and then you would base your different volume-based protocols on that 100% value and take a percentage of that.
Yeah, and like certainly for this athlete in question, we've seen some movement in that 100% value, and that as FVC has moved on. Probably need to combine that with a further spirometry kind of assessment, because the key thing was working on that kind of FEV1 to FVC ratio, where there was quite a big limitation. Like the total volume was big, but actually his capacity to use that, particularly in the early part of the breath, was a little bit more limited. So yeah, combining that with a further spirometry assessment and being able to give a bit more detail would be really good. But yeah, we've already seen some increases in that volume, so that's been really positive. And that's literally after probably 4 weeks to 5 weeks of training. So
Yeah,
yeah, we'll see how it goes.
It's interesting. I don't have many case studies yet, but working with an older gentleman as a private client, and he always mentioned that his respiration was a limiting factor when he was doing his different activities. He does a lot of skiing. We do some rowing during our sessions, and just giving him, and again, he's not at an elite training status, so there is probably a lot more room for improvement than for the populations that you work with. But for him, over a 4-week period with 2 training sessions a week, he was able to add a liter to his total FVC. So he went from 4.9 to 5.9 liter, I believe. Again, then there's the idea of how do you apply that within your training, and how do you use that volume? Because having the volume doesn't mean you can use it properly. But again, I think it's encouraging to see that there is a lot of improvement potential on that side. And like you said, it's cheap training in the sense that it can be included in low intensity days or after a long aerobic session. It doesn't need to cost a lot of money off of your credit card to steal your analogy there. So definitely something to explore in the coming months. I want to shift to talking about you as a coach right now. What are you interested about? What are you researching? What are you trying to develop in your own skill set?
Yeah, I guess the thing I've probably been most interested in recently is kind of around the impact of kind of lean muscle mass, particularly for rowers. I think sometimes it gets a bit of a bad rep. Like it kind of goes through phases. Like maybe like 20 years ago, everyone was like, yeah, muscle mass, athletic performance, it's a big winner. And then I guess it's kind of gone slightly more modern age, and people have gone, well, actually, I can't carry too much mass. It's not going to be beneficial if it's not then impacting something else. But I think that's the key thing, is like, is lean mass going to impact something else? And certainly in rowers, I've seen that it can do. So that's one topic I've been pretty kind of interested in thinking about recently. Definitely some kind of further insight into our kind of critical power modeling and taking that step further. So what we actually do is also kind of estimate some of our 2K performances. And from what I've seen, we actually using a distance model rather than a power model. We've seen like less than 1% difference from predicted to actual 2K outcomes, which in sports science is like completely unheard of. Like to get something that tight as an estimate is really, really good. So like it kind of really showed us that the profiling is a good representation of the performance, but actually there's not a huge amount on that. So it'd be interesting to explore that kind of distance relationship with the C2 ergo. Yeah, it's probably those two really. That's been the main things I've been looking at, and yeah, going from there.
No, I love it, man. James, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on and exchange on all those topics. Maybe as some closing thoughts, what are you looking forward to either doing or researching in the coming months?
So I mean, I'm definitely looking forward to what's going to happen this season. I think certainly from being involved in sport, it's going to be a really fascinating one to see what's going to happen with the games. I don't think it's going to be a normal Olympic Games, that's for sure. So that's going to be really, really interesting. I think I've really liked kind of what we've discussed around training for kind of specific physiological limitations. And I think at the long term, that's going to be quite impactful. And going to be something we can really use. But I think that's a kind of beyond Tokyo kind of thought process. That would be my closing ones.
Yeah, it'd be actually fascinating to get some Moxie and physiological data on the guys, and then compare that to the critical power models that you use, and see what how they complementary, or do we find the kind of the same conclusions out of them. So maybe a story for later in the podcast. Maybe
definitely.
In 9 months, in a year, we should get back on here and maybe talk about all those things. James, where can people find out more about you on social?
Yeah, so I'm most active probably on Instagram. So it's at JG Physical Performance, and also on Twitter as well. It's Goody GOODY _10 is my Twitter handle. So that tends to be the two that I use the most.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, man.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sean. It was an absolute pleasure.